Okay, good morning everybody. So I hope you're enjoying the UTIC conference so far. So it's the first time I've attended the UTIC conference. Actually, it's the first time I've ever spent so much time working outside, which has been a real pleasure. It's been very nice, I have to say. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about change, and change without disruption. And I feel a little bit as though some of this is going to follow along with the themes that we've just seen. Some of the things that Renato Benito introduced when he was giving a little reflection on what he was talking about. And a lot of what Kim just talked about. So, I'm not turning that off. I feel as though is a lot of what I'm going to talk about. So I hope it's going to be interesting enough for you, and perhaps a slightly different take on things. So change without disruption is what I want to talk about a little bit. So I want to delve a little bit into how the world has changed. And we're going to look at some fairly big macro themes that affect and define the way we see the world today, and how it changes the way we need to think about how we do things. So we start off by asking the question, is there less trust in the world? And whether it's political polarization, or whether it's Facebook giving away your personal information. I mean, we see day after day somebody breaching your trust and leaking personal information on the internet. That sort of thing. We're basically living in a time where which is fundamentally characterized by a lack of trust. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm moving my screen and not this one. I've got two things to push now, sorry. Okay. So as illustration of the world. So we look at this graph, which is being produced by the Global Trust Barometer from Edelman. I don't know if you've ever seen this before, but they record the sort of feedback and the level of trust in non-governmental organizations, businesses, government, and the media, so that they can try and determine whether or not they are doing what is correct. And the distrust of government and the media is particularly noticeable when you look at this slide. So we see that NGOs and businesses, it hasn't changed very much from 2018 to 2019, but it's still not particularly good. And if we look at government and media, again, there's only a slight improvement between 2018 and 2019, but they're noticeably low. Probably no real surprise there. So if you think about the overall trust, the level of trust in world's institutions for about the last 10 years, do you think trust has been declining, growing, or staying the same over that period of time? So maybe we can see by a show of hands, who thinks trust has been mostly declining? A few people. Who thinks it's stayed the same? Anyone? And who thinks trust has mainly been growing? Not too many. So most people clearly think that trust has been declining. In fact, it's been pretty much stable and hasn't really changed, at least in the last 10 years. And when we took this data and looked at it and went back even further than those 12 years, it was the same pattern. Nothing had really changed over that period of time. So what has changed? I mean, the whole reason we looked at this presentation in the first place was because, at SGL anyway, we thought something had changed. Maybe that's just because we're headquartered in the UK, and we're all fairly disillusioned with Brexit and everything else that's going on. So if you think about that, one thing that has changed, and that's been it's been mentioned already quite a bit by Kimo this morning, is fake news. Everybody's concerned about that, and almost 3/4 of the people on the Edelman Trust Barometer sample were worried about fake news. And if you wanted to know any more about that kind of thing, you only had to listen to the concerns that the European Union have over that, or Google fake videos, or deep fake, and you can learn a lot about that type of information. But if the level of distrust hasn't changed, then what has changed? And the answer is the internet. And in particular, what's changed is people's ability to do something about that distrust. So in previous years, you couldn't do very much about it. You read it, you felt unhappy. You had no real mechanism for doing something about it. Today you do. Today we have the opportunity to get more informed. But equally, there's so much information on the internet today that it's very hard to distinguish the difference between what's fake news and what's real news, and then try and understand what to do about it. So we start off with a base level of trust, and then we have an opportunity to be informed. But despite that, we're just worried about fake news. We can read as much as we like about through Sky News, YouTube, Facebook, BBC News, but you don't really know whether it's true or not. And this is the concern that people have. So what do we do about that? Who do we trust? So normally, we turn to people we would have a connection with, and people we think we could trust, and we rely on our own experience. So connectedness matters, and it matters a lot. So for example, if we compare the levels of trust that we've already looked at in the Edelman Trust Barometer with the level of trust that people have in their employer, the difference is quite noticeable. But why would we trust our own employer? At least I hope most people would trust their own employer. But why would we trust our own employer when we don't trust other organizations? And that's because we have a personal connection with our own employer that we don't have with other organizations. So we know enough about our employers' values and their motives for working with us that can bring them into our own circle of trust. And organizations that don't have this, they have to work a lot harder in order to be able to achieve that. So we see that values are becoming increasingly important if we look at this graph. And this was a global Nielsen survey. And in there, they asked consumers about the influence of a number of non-cost related factors on their recent purchases. And the most important factor that was listed by about 62% of those respondents as a heavy or very heavy influencer was trust in the brand. Now just below that, interestingly enough, was wellness benefits and fresh natural ingredients, things like that. And their high rating indicates another new and very important trend. And this is powered by greater internet connectivity and greater access to the information that brings. A Forrester called this the emergence of the values-based consumer. And when we talk about the values-based consumer, we mean that increasingly people are asking the question, where should I spend my money? And who should I engage with? They're looking to do business with people and brands that share their values. And what those values are depends entirely on the audience. So for example, when we first started looking and preparing this presentation and discussing how the world has changed, we noticed there was a growing reaction to the excesses of consumerism. And that's reflected in these set of values, where people are more concerned about quality in the bigger picture. They're more focused on less is more, as opposed to more is better, where the focus is completely different. It's obvious, really, isn't it, that if your audience is focused on one or the other, that you'd address them in very different ways. So the content has to change depending on the audience that you're looking at. And this is actually good news for individuals and organizations that have to build on this trust in the age of the internet, because communicating a sense of shared values is a new way to build the connections that help to create trust. But what does this mean for the translation industry? So in the internet age, content matters more than ever. It's obvious. Before the internet, people were distrustful, but they have a lot of personal interaction, but limited choice. They can't do very much about it. After the internet, people are still distrustful, but they have lots of personal interaction, much more choice, and so their values matter. And if you consider what it takes to build connections of trust with a target audience that's very suspicious of being fooled, they're often remote and they can very easily look somewhere else for an alternative product, that's the challenge of the internet age. This is the challenge that any individual or corporation working in this environment has to deal with. And in order to engage with people in this context, they have to work a lot harder in order to build that trust. So the content that they produce, what they say and how they say it, becomes much more important than it used to be. So for the translation industry, this is both an opportunity and a challenge. The opportunity lies in the new importance of content and the fact that every piece of content you create has to work harder than ever to build that trust. It doesn't matter if it's a legal contract, an advertising campaign, a how-to manual, or a video game. Every piece of content and every piece of communication is a touch point, and it matters because it's so easy for the audience to decide they can go somewhere else. So quality becomes more important than ever. Now, when I show this slide, you're probably all thinking, well, we've always looked after quality for our customers. Everybody does it. It's been a subject matter that everybody has been speaking about for years. And it's nothing new. And probably some of you have worked using quality measurement systems and things like that. Maybe regularly, maybe occasionally. However, today, our industry's traditional measures of quality are just a start. So things like spelling, grammar, punctuation, accuracy, consistency, these are all things that are increasingly being taken for granted. These are expected by your customers. And as they try harder to connect with their audience, they're going to expect a lot more from you. So that whole definition of quality is going to change. Now, of course, if the source material is completely rubbish, there's going to be a limit to how much you can do to improve it. But as brands start to realize that their content has to communicate more clearly and more powerfully than before, then that's going to put greater expectations on you to deliver the original and the translation. Now, these new expectations may be quite intangible, and perhaps they're a little bit difficult to measure. But as you all know, all good translators, you know how to achieve that as long as you're given the time to apply your craft, which is something that translators always complain about. They never have enough time in order to provide a really good quality translation written the way they would like to write it. It takes real skill to make a language as user-friendly as possible, or to choose just the right words that convey authenticity or a specific personality. And this expanded sense of quality and a greater need for craft in translation is good for everyone in the industry. It takes the understanding and skill of real human beings to convey the hallmarks of quality, to say you can trust the information and the value of those that brought it to you. So hallmarks that say, you can trust us. Now, the challenge for all this, as we keep talking about, is that this is the age of the internet. And that means that your customers can't afford to wait. No change there. I need it now is very much a continuing trend. And just because greater quality in translation is critical, it doesn't mean we can take our own sweet time delivering it. So quality at speed is the expectation. And that means we have to be much more efficient in our delivery of quality. We have to make time for our craft, not by taking longer by the job, but by finding productivity boosters that can create time for greater craft. So from a translator's perspective, anybody who attended Sameh Ragheb's presentation yesterday probably came away with a lot of information that you wanted to go away and try to see how you could improve the productivity of yourself when you're working. And this same thing is happening across the board at every level of the translation process. But let's just think about the nature of change for a few minutes. So in 35 years, this year is the 35th anniversary of Trados, if those of you who didn't know. So there's been various birthday parties around the place for Trados. Trados has seen a lot of change. And naturally, we've gone through a lot of organizational change. When I joined in 2006, I actually joined SDL, not Trados, but we just bought Trados. And As a technology business and a driver of technology that's used in translation, we've been at the heart of the digital transformation journey for the past few decades. We were there for the start of the internet age, the revolutionary change that set the context for this keynote and others. And today we're up to our elbows in cloud delivery, neural machine translation, and other fast developing trends in translation technology. And when we think about these changes, it's very easy to conclude that change is happening more dramatically than ever before. After all, not only has the global internet use almost doubled in the past 10 years, but 10 years ago, the iPhone was barely 2 years old. Airbnb wasn't even 1 yet. Uber had just been founded. And practical neural machine translation was still around 5 years away. Makes me feel even older than I am when I see that slide. But these kinds of truly disruptive technologies or business models, although they make the headlines, are actually very rare. There's no doubt that technology is developing fast. But that doesn't mean that the transformation for organizations or industries, even when you consider their use of technology, is disruptive. For example, all around the world, hospitals are working very hard to try and remove paper processes. They want to create digital workflows around health records. That's not disruptive. The main aim is to avoid disruption for doctors and patients. But it truly is transformative. It transforms how quickly and effectively hospitals can get things done. And it can save lives. And this is what transformation looks like for most industries, most of the time. The technology driving or enabling these transformations, it might be considered disruptive or revolutionary. But usually if we dig into a revolutionary technology, we find it's got very long evolutionary precedents. So either way, the uptake of these technologies for real change in our lives, it may be fast, but it's not usually so disruptive that we can't manage that change. So it's still true that the major parts of our work and daily life are evolving pretty fast. But it's manageable change, as long as we don't stand still. So change may seem more disruptive than it really is. But what can we expect from the future? And more importantly, what's driving the change? Understanding this is key to embracing that change and making sure that we're comfortable doing the things that we have to do as the industry moves along with us or without us. If you talk to the executive at any company, no matter how large or small, they always have the same goals. They want to attract and retain customers, because that's going to help them with their next goal, which is they want to make money. They want to grow their revenue. As a company, they want to get bigger and bigger. But also global companies want to decrease the time that it takes for them to actually get their products to the market. And that's because it's a complicated, expensive process. And they're always focused on increasing operational efficiencies. So these are universal goals. And for too long, these goals have been dominated by thinking about them in the context of the country or the region in where the company is headquartered. So you have to ask the question, what comes first? Oh, there's something missing off my slide. You're missing a very nice picture of a chicken and an egg, which was quite topical with all the chickens running around. But the question was, are these companies trying to generate the sales? So do they focus on generating the sales to justify that translation spend? Or do they build that demand by translating the content first and spending the money up front so they can enter that digital market before they've even established the sales? And this is a difficult question. And typically, companies have always had to make a decision whether they do one or the other. Well, we think in the future, companies will do both. And they'll do it by making better use of technology. So we all translate and deliver content. But to take an omni-market approach, where we're delivering all content in all language for all products, right from the beginning, it requires a lot more than just looking at trying to get a little bit from each step in the process. Because customers today, they want a complete, immersive digital experience, and that requires a lot of content. Now, the main reason why companies haven't considered this approach before is because that struggle to create, translate, and deliver that content is seemingly impossible, and it's just not worth the cost. And that's primarily because the struggle to translate everything is too human. And we know this because we know the average amount of words a translator can complete in a day. And that pales in comparison to the amount of content people generally consume. So an average translator or a linguist, if we just say 5,000 words, clearly that's going to be different depending on the content and everything else. But if we say 5,000 words, it's also easier to do the maths. And we say the average American consumes in content about 49 to 50,000 words a day. Sounds a lot. I didn't believe it when I first saw it. But if you imagine 300 words a minute and you work backwards, it's only a couple of hours reading. And if you look at all the blogs, the articles, emails, newspapers, textbooks, fiction books, everything you read, that probably is a very conservative estimate of the amount of material people get through. Now that struggle is costly. If you imagine that if we take that same words per day and we assume that every single one of those words will get translated, and we take a word rate of 16 cents a word, this is the rate to a company purchasing those translations. So they're paying for the DTP, they're paying for the editing, the translation. That rate is not just the translation rate, it's everything. So they're paying a lot of money for all of those things. But even like that, it's nearly $8,000 for just those words for one. And that's only into one language. And no company is going to pay that much money for that content a day. It's too expensive. It's also very time consuming. So you take that same amount of words at 5,000 words a day, that's 10 business days. It's too long. By the time one translator had done that work, they'd have another 500,000 words piling up over the course of those 10 words. You would never keep on top of it. So you could add another 10 translators, and then you could get it done in a day, but there just aren't enough translators to be able to cope with that amount of content. And that's why it takes so long to produce. There's also a struggle with process. So tons of companies out there are not taking advantage of translation automation. And for them, translation is a very human process. And very often it does actually look something like this. Large companies, they go through a huge number of manual steps. It's entirely human driven. And they are providing all of this information. They are taking and causing all the breaks in the process and being the sticking point to prevent things being done more quickly. Now, all of those struggles are real. And they've been hurdles to the idea that a company could translate everything that they talk about into all languages for all markets. It's never been deemed possible before because those hurdles were just too high to overcome. So we think about how we got here. We kind of have a human-first, machine-optimized approach. Originally, translators would take the same content creation tools that everybody else used. So perhaps they translated in Microsoft Word, and you might just replace the text word by word. And then in the 90s, there was a major advancement with the introduction of Trados, the first computer-assisted translation workbase. And that provided a way for linguists, many of you are probably Trados users, it provided a way for you to reuse your previous work over and over. But that work had to change as well, because you had to worry about files being filtered correctly. And you now translated sentence by sentence instead of by paragraph, starting to reduce the ability to be more creative in the translation work. About a decade after this, companies started adopting translation automation tools. And the first business-oriented translation management systems were being deployed. But again, humans had to manage those processes, and they were responsible for all the different steps in that workflow. Around about the same time, companies started looking at machine translation for non-important content, like knowledge base articles and things like that. But all of these things, as people were working with them and time going on, are prone to errors and things going wrong. Machine translation that repeats the same errors over and over again, and things that translators have to go back and correct and change. So we haven't really got away from that human-first, machine-optimized approach to the work. We could take some responsibility for this for this approach, because we've been in the industry for a while, and many people will blame us for the fuzzy matching and all the other things that that people have to work to today. But we believe the best way to address these challenges is by flipping that paradigm that we help to introduce. So we have some experience here. We have a lot of in-house linguists. We're responsible for probably about 70% market coverage of users using Trados, and we translate about 300 billion words with machine translation a year. So we have some idea of where the problems are, things that you all experience at different levels. We experience it across the whole gamut from start to finish of the content creation. And that's how we know that linguists can't translate the amount of content that people consume, but machines can. Now, that doesn't mean that humans become irrelevant. As Kimmo pointed out, this is where a lot of the material I'm covering now is very similar. It just means the roles change. Now, the first real important role that linguists now take on is literally to teach the machines. And that's happening all the time. Many of you probably doing it with many companies and perhaps have not even thought about what you're doing. So, for example, I was talking to Sammy during the week. We talk about My Memory, people using My Memory. Everybody likes My Memory because it's reasonably cheap, free if you don't take the professional version, but you're feeding information in your translations all the time to help them improve the machines and everything else. All of this is being used to help improve the way the machines work. So we're already doing this. Will also help to build more relevance in the content being translated. So machine translation, if you use it, can provide a translation into the different language, but you're then going to provide that same translation to a different culture in a different language, in a different context, and you've got to change that translation. The machine is not capable of doing that. So there's still work for linguists to do there to make sure the content is relevant to where it has to go. And last but not least, people are going to have access to more data than ever. And they need to be able to look at that data and decide how to use that data so that they can focus their efforts on other things that can provide added value to the customers they're working for. So we need to think about the changes in how we work using the skills that we already have and apply them in different ways. And the more that we expose this data to the people who are involved in this process, the more data-driven decisions those people will be able to take. The machine, on the other hand, is going to carry on doing what it does at the moment, only more so. So scaling translations will be faster than ever before, thanks to neural machine translation. Thanks to mature translation automation, it's going to provide improved consistency with less human effort. I don't know if any of you have ever worked with a trained engine, maybe even working into Russian, but the translation quality, and I'm happy to take a challenge on this from anybody at some point, the quality of a machine translation from a trained engine, even into Russian from English now, is remarkably good. So things are changing. And today we spend a lot of time and money and effort on consistency of quality from one project to the next for our clients. But it's still largely human-driven. And when you embed trained and refined machines into that process, they can consistently translate over and over again the way we want them to. So we're looking for a machine-first, human-optimized approach. And the beauty of this is that delivering a solution that is machine first but still human optimized, and we let the machine take the first pass at everything because there's just simply too much to do, and we can't do it all, and humans are a limited resource, is we can concentrate on the relevancy and subject matter expertise, providing the finishing touches, and focus on the more important aspects of a translation. And it's by doing this combination of machine first but still human optimized approach that is going to support companies in their endeavors to deliver on their omni-market goal, which is translating everything that they talk about in every language, in every single market from the beginning. And it's the only way we're going to be achieving this. Now, this is a paradigm shift. It's a change in the way we think about translation. It's a change in the way the localization industry behaves. But it's making the way we've all been doing business a little bit obsolete. We call it intelligent translation. We believe it consists of 5 major elements. So we have tech connected, which should be highlighted, but it's not working for some reason on the screen. So we're talking about the first one, tech connected. This really means direct links between content repositories and translation management systems. So we know for a fact this has a huge effect on streamlining processes when you have that direct connection. And by centralizing linguistic data, that can be applied everywhere to all of the content that a company produces. So integrations are vitally important to intelligent translation. So this is why we've always had a very big focus on APIs, for example. It was me. Human-driven, this is the problem, you see. So we consider the machine first. This is just ensuring that machine translation takes the first pass at the content. Of course, there are still some exceptions to that rule, but increasingly we see advancements and improvement in quality in neural machine translation, and that makes those exceptions rarer. Now, by taking advantage of linguistic artificial intelligence, we can capture and elevate the right data for people to analyze, whether they're project managers or individual translators. No matter where they are in the translation process, everybody involved needs more data than they're currently getting today. The next major element would be implementing and standardizing continuous localization. And for companies to do this today, it's very much a bespoke model, which requires significant investment and customization. And these early adopters, they're going to find their process becoming more standardized, because that content won't be sent for translation in large handoffs, but instead it will be in small and more frequent iterations of content directly from the content management systems. And last but not least, the solution has to connect in some way to the larger community, the translation community. So you guys are a limited resource. You spend a lot of time educating yourselves. You've got a wealth of experience that machines don't have. And a good solution needs to make sure that we plug you in as seamlessly as possible and as easily as possible, so that you can continue to apply that human touch to translations and have more time to concentrate on your craft at the right time. So just as the solution is connected to content, we've also got to connect that content to the human network of linguists, translators. And by bringing all of these elements together into one single intelligent translation process, companies will then be able to deliver all of that content to all customers across all markets in all languages, and be able to fulfill their goal of an omni-market strategy. So change without disruption. It's a paradigm shift in the way our customers think about doing global business. And it embraces the sort of change that translators, that you guys have been increasingly adopting for yourselves as you take advantage of all the new technologies that have been introduced to you over the years. I mean, it wasn't that long ago where I could read on a pro's website how machine translation was rubbish and it would never be a useful tool for translators. Today, if it's switched off, you'd think the world had ended. So we have it, change without disruption. Change we need to embrace, and change to make sure it works for us as effectively as it works for our customers. Te akuyu. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. It was a great keynote speech, and I'm absolutely sure that it was the greatest keynote speech prepared in one day. Absolutely, thank you.
Only keynote speech I have ever given.
Oh, congratulations! So your first night here. Thank you. Можливо, ми можемо. Can we ask questions to Kimo and Paul? You may say, I'll bring you the mic.
Thank you for the great speech. I actually have been working with a neural machine translation trained to translate from English into Ukrainian, not Russian. And it does work great within that data set that's been used for training that machine translation. So I can vouch for that. It's really good. My question is regarding the human role. There were three headings stating the human role within the translation. Would you say the human translation would still be applicable for highly confidential documents? For example, something you don't want to feed into that machine translation system, so it doesn't show up anywhere else after you've translated the confidential document and something like that.
I mean, that's a really good question. And we have many customers who deal only in confidential information, and they use machine translation. And we can do that by providing them with very secure methods to be able to share that information so they can be confident that it's not being exposed anywhere else. But if you're receiving a document from your customer, for example, as a translator, and that's highly confidential, and they ask you not to use machine translation for it, then it's less a question, for me anyway, it's less a question of whether or not somebody will be able to get at that data, and it's more a question of the fact that they asked you not to use machine translation. So the first thing would be, if you were asked not to do it, you simply shouldn't use it. That would be my own view on it. But if you were using a public machine translation engine, then you'd have to be aware that anybody can intercept that source material at any time if they chose to, and had a mechanism for getting at it. So sending information to Google or My Memory, or even to SDL to some extent, all of that information, it's possible for somebody to be able to get at it. What the machine translation providers do with that data, I've no idea. I can tell you that at SDL we don't keep the material because we're not really interested in the source content you send us itself. We keep it long enough to provide a translation and then we lose it. We don't store the information. I can only tell you that. It's up to you to decide whether you believe me or not. If you take Google, for example, or some other companies, clearly they don't. They use the information for other reasons. So if you use Google Translate and you're logged in and you start translating particular material, you might find when you go to Gmail the next time, you start getting adverts that are related to the content you've just been translating. So clearly the information can be used. So I think if you're translating very private documentation, you either have to do it in a secure environment or understand the limitations of what could happen and make a decision on whether you use it or not. So that would be my view on that. I don't know if that really answers your question.
Any questions? Kimmo, would you like to comment?
Yes, in a way, we have a similar situation with our e-translation system that I presented. And in fact, it was one of the reasons that we decided to use an in-house machine translation system was because when the system is used, these 40 million pages, some of that is very confidential material that cannot be sent outside. And therefore, this already the predecessor system, the MT@EC system, was very strictly in-house, and it was run on local servers inside the Commission premises, so that nothing ever left, no piece of text ever left the environment. And the same goes for this e-translation, translating these 40 million pages. It's still very secure, and that's how it has to be if the system is to translate health records of individuals, for example. So it's a designed feature of the system is for it to be secure. Now, I wouldn't be fully honest with you if I said there's not a weak link. There is a weak point in that is the cloud, because the system is running on a cloud. And simply because our internal servers were not powerful enough to churn these 40 million pages. So we have to use cloud. And we are using commercial cloud providers. We have a cloud agreement with Amazon Web Services, with Microsoft. So, okay, we have a non-disclosure agreement with them as they promised they will not disclose any of the cloud content, and we can trust them or we may not trust them. But that's the weak link. If you want to remove that weak link, we would have to create our own cloud, basically. But that beats the purpose of cloud, because the cloud is supposed to be flexible. So to some extent you will have that problem.
So it's really interesting for me just to know, for example, there is a machine translation service providers. And in the case, for example, there is such services that contain millions of pages, perhaps confidential documents, is hacked. What influence it may just really do, and what kind of I don't know of things can be done to prevent it?
Just
Well, I think the only way to prevent it is to put it in a secure cloud, exactly as Kimo just said. That is the only way. You have to be behind a firewall, probably not even connected to the internet, just to the global internet, just working on an internet is the only way. What can happen if somebody got the data? I have no idea. It depends what the data was, I suppose. I don't really know how to answer that question.
Yeah,
I mean, we send sentence by sentence. So I suppose if somebody was collecting every sentence rather than the whole document, they could, and you was sent it through a cloud, they could reproduce the document. Maybe if you were releasing a new product, somebody could find that information and then use something about it. If they deliberately targeted you because they knew you were translating that. I mean, in reality, the scope for a serious breach is probably quite small, unless somebody knew what you were doing. But if you regularly worked for an organisation that was, and I guess that's where you're coming from, really. But I guess if you worked for an organisation on a regular basis and used cloud-based machine translations on a regular basis, and somebody knew it, then I suppose they could, in theory, target you and use the information for something. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's. I would say that the security very often is an issue of risk management, and it's a trade-off between cost and security. And you can increase the security, but it will always be more expensive. Like there is the British Human Genome Project is storing sequenced human genomes of people. They have to guarantee a very high level of security and confidentiality. So they maintain this genome data in underground bunkers where there are military people patrolling to make sure that there are no intruders. So that's a physically contained space. That's obviously very expensive to do that, but it's secure.
Well, could there be a possibility in the near future that freelance translators could have their own neural MT engines to train offline at their own premises without exposing their own translations to other online platforms like DeepL or whatever? I mean, if we can have even purchase the technology, we can really make use of the machine translation, but offline, without,
So there's an opportunity to do that today. But I truly don't think anybody could afford it. This is the question. It takes a tremendous amount of processing power, and is very expensive, and nobody would sell it to you very cheaply. There are solutions out there now. I've forgotten the name of it. There's a plugin for Studio, and I still can't remember the name of it, that allows you to build your own MT engine yourself, and you can run it. And there was a lot of talk about it for a long time. But actually, over the last few years that it's been run, I never see anybody talking about it, because I think the quality that can be achieved through that just pales into significance compared to the quality that you get from the big providers who really have the processing power to be able to provide this and do it properly.
Okay, but when you say it's expensive, how expensive?
Well, you've got to maintain your own servers. You can't just put it on a computer. You've got to maintain your own servers. How expensive is that? How big a server do you actually need? The sale of the technology, I've no idea how much we'd sell it to you, but it's going to be 6 to 7 figures. So it's more than you're going to pay for a license of Studio. Yeah.
I could add to this, I mean, trying to estimate the cost. This e-translation system that is capable of handling 40 million pages, and I think it has capacity to do 80 million actually. So it's not used as full capacity. The cloud services that are purchased for that on market conditions, they cost the order of between 1 and 2 million euro a year. So that's the order of the cost for that sort of volume. So it all depends on what is the volume. Of course, it takes a certain amount of initial processing power investment to train your model, to create the empty system in the first place. But once it's created, then it's only running that model, and it's cheaper than that, but that's maybe the order of magnitude of what we pay for our cloud service for this system that churns 40 million pages a year.
So probably not worth the investment.
I have two small questions. First one, I want to ask you about human translation, like classic translation. When you, in your opinion, when it will be better to use the translation like this, not machine translation? And the second one, I want to ask about if one new company come to translation marketing, how it can take trust from customers. Thank you.
I'll answer the first one first. That's probably easier. Can you just repeat the first part of the question again? I lost the thread of where I was going with it. Oh, yes, I've got it. That really depends on the content and what you're actually doing. So, for example, I attended a very interesting talk from Maria on audio description on Wednesday, which was all about how when you're translating, if you're translating subtitles, for example, but you're doing it for blind people, it's not enough to just translate word for word. You need to see the video in context, and you need to create the translation so that it explains to a blind person what's on the screen. So it's more than just translation. A machine translation can never do that. This is always going to require a human with the right expertise and skills to be able to identify the psychology that's required to allow a blind person to understand what's on that actual film. So there are lots of things like that that will require humans and not machines, not for a very long time. So that would be one example. Another example might be if you translate a sentence with machine translation from one language to another, the actual machine translation itself, whilst it might be technically correct, has a totally different meaning and makes no sense whatsoever in the other language. Machine translation engines are not yet capable of having that type of distinction. So it very much depends on the content. And that's why you're always going to need a human, really, to review it. The more important the content is, the more you want to try and build that trust with a client by making sure the translations are correct, the more you have to make sure there's a human involved. It's not enough just to apply machine translation and let it go, no matter how good the neural machine translation engines are today. And actually, the worst thing about neural machine translation, if there is a worst thing, is it's fluent. It's incredibly fluent. So you translate from one language to another, and the translation comes out, and it's perfect Russian, perfect French. And you're thinking, and I'm thinking, wow, that person just told me it's real, until I show him the source, and he said, it's really good, it's real, but actually that's not what it means. And so there's a real problem there, and you always need to have a human who can play that off. And whether you just use machine translation or just use humans or a mixture of the two depends on the context, who it's for, how much they're paying for it. So a lot of factors come into play there. It's a human decision. And your second question. Oh, good. Thank you. The second question. The second question was about how does an LSP get started? Oh. I don't know. I think that's I think that's probably a good topic for a roundtable discussion. It's nothing that I can. It's nothing that I even want to try to attempt to answer. But I'd be happy to discuss it. We can talk about it. Yeah.
I would also say to this about humans, what humans should translate or validate is the legal translations. In our case, so the European Union, where we translate legislation, we need humans to validate because we cannot trust machines alone, because each translation is legally authentic, which means that each translation of a legislation can be applied in court of justice. And that means that you cannot entrust that kind of translation task to a machine which does not necessarily know the legal subtleties of certain terms in different languages. So at least those translations must be at least verified by humans.
And one last question. And our speakers are here today and tomorrow, so you may approach them and ask questions.
Thank you, Paul, for your great presentation. I have a question to you. Do you think the neural machine translation will replace human translators in the near future? And if yes, in your opinion, how much time do we have to get prepared to this disaster?
If I had a watch, I could look at my watch, but no. I don't think neural machine translation is going to replace human translators in the near future. I think it's probably quite a long way off before, even in the far future, before it completely replaces human translators. The whole point here is that we want to use machines, neural machine translation, linguistic AI, to try and take away the processes that currently you have to do that are almost drudgery, repetitive process, to take all of those away and leave the human to focus on things that can't be done by a machine. There is simply too much that cannot be done by a machine at the moment. At what point a machine will be smart enough to be able to apply all the context and things like that we've been talking about is anyone's guess. I have no idea. But I'm pretty confident it won't be in my lifetime. Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.